Okay, then, back to Isaiah, our study of the book of Isaiah, using the notes of my seminary professor, Professor David Needham, and just kind of seeing what he shared back then. I haven't looked at it in years, but a good way to interact with the book of Isaiah and try to learn some things and see some things. We just finished a section that was called the oracles. So if you look back, or just you could flip back through the chapters of your Bible, or just kind of think through it if you were here. Oracles are heavy words from God, words of judgment, and it was against many nations. So in chapters 13 through 23, we had oracles against God's own people, as well as the nations of Edom and Tyre and Damascus and Philistia, or the Philistines, Moab, Babylon. We really focused a lot on the prophecies against Babylon as a type or an example of the kind of things God was saying against these other nations. Going to turn off our back monitor here. There we go. And so we've had these various statements being made to particular nations. So very limited geographically. We're not talking about a landmass the size of the United States about these nations. All of them were fairly small. Of the ones mentioned there. Even Babylon, though, covered a pretty large area at times. So did, the Medes and the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, obviously. So some of these kingdoms got quite large that are talked about even in the Bible. Some of them were quite small. But where we come today in chapter 24 is really about it's an oracle against the entire world. So it's quite different than what we saw in the previous 13 through 23. We to chapter 24. At this point in the handout, though, he gave us or in the class notes, he gave us kind of a recap of the book up to this point. And I don't know if we really want to read everything he had here, or maybe you'd like to, but just a quick recap. Chapter 1 of Isaiah. Or maybe for you watching on YouTube, if you didn't see these things, you could go back and find the videos on YouTube. Chapter 1 is called Courtroom Scene. And this is, again, Professor Needham's ways to express and explain the book of Isaiah. Courtroom Scene, we saw God speaking against his nation, saying, he has a problem with their ungodliness. Kind of a prologue, obviously, the first chapter. It talked about coming righteousness. So chapters 2 through 5 was shattered dreams. I guess I won't read all of these things. If we wanted to at the end and we had a lot of extra time, I could go back and read these. Shattered dreams was chapters 2 through 5. They could have had many blessings of God, but they didn't because of their own trusting in themselves and other kingdoms and things like this. We got to chapter 6, and it's kind of like another start to the book. It's called Flashback, Isaiah's Call. Chapter 7 through 12 focus on Emmanuel, God with us, the coming Messiah. Chapters 13 through 23 were the oracles, and now we get to chapter 24. So I don't have as much tonight, but that doesn't necessarily mean I'll get through it quickly. Let's just see how long it takes and how long our discussion goes. When I read through Isaiah, I read lots of striking things in all these chapters. I mean, any of the chapters seem they grab your attention in lots of different ways. For whatever reason, Professor Needham really felt that this was one of only 3 chapters in Isaiah that are really, I don't know, how do you describe them? Magnificent. There are many magnificent chapters in our Bibles. Perhaps all of them are such because they depict something of the greatness of our God. Some of these magnificent chapters unfold his love or grace or power or some other facet of his being. A few are majestic because they unfold his infinite, terrible wrath. To read them is to tremble. So he calls this a magnificent chapter in the way it's depicting the wrath of God. To read them is to tremble, to truly read them. He says 3 such chapters are in the book of Isaiah, which is 66 chapters long, if I remember correctly. They are chapters 24, 34, and the first 6 verses of chapter 63. after 11 chapters of heavy oracles against the nations, that's 13 through 23, chapter 24 gives us the final page. And he calls this Vanity Fair closes down, the death groans of the earth. Let's see here. Yeah, it's another mixture. We're going to read through it. You're going to hear a mixture of looking ahead and seeing the day when the whole earth dies, but in the midst of it, they're still rejoicing. And then the following chapters have lots of joy, but there's judgment coming, but there's God's kingdom coming. There's lots of recurring themes that go back and forth here. But what does he mean by the carnival is over? Vanity Fair closes down, Vanity Fair closes down, not the carnival is over, that was the subtitle? No, the death groans of the earth is the subtitle. Vanity Fair closes down. All right, so I'm just going to read you a little bit here, just a perspective on this chapter. He says, as the dramatic climax to the oracle section, okay, so he's saying that chapters 13 through 23 are not really the end of the oracles. It's really 13 through 24. But he separates out chapter 24 because it's a unique oracle. 13 through 23 are specific to certain nations only. Chapter 24 is to the whole earth, to all of mankind. So it's part of the oracles, but he treats it separately in his notes. It's the conclusion, the climax to the oracles. And he titled it, Vanity Fair closes down. As I said last week, I think we mentioned last week, and some of you knew exactly what I was talking about. Where's Vanity Fair in famous Christian fiction? in Pilgrim's Progress, that's right, John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. He arrives at Vanity Fair, symbolic of the world's obsession with sensual pleasures. And he provides an illustration called Alive for the First Time. He doesn't say where he got this from. He says this parallels the chapter. So I just want to read to you an illustration here about this idea of Vanity Fair and the world and the judgment that comes against it. So check this out. Listen to this. I found it quite interesting, very descriptive. In simplistic contrast with Babylon, I spent my earliest years in the small, sleepy town of Glendora in Southern California. Small, sleepy town. But once a year, at least in my childhood recollections, my town came alive. During the night, overloaded trucks rumbled into town, depositing all sorts of marvelous things onto a large, ugly, vacant lot near our school. The carnival had arrived. The next day, our teachers must have had a terrible time gaining our attention. Never did the clock hands move so slowly. From time to time, I would reach into my pocket to be sure those few nickels were still there. All ears, including our teachers, were listening for only one sound, the closing bell. Moments afterwards, we children found ourselves pressing through the brightly colored, beckoning passageway past canvas walls into a fantasy world of motion, sounds, and smells. Hours raced by as we slipped past the hawkers, shouting above the sounds of the wheezing steam calliope. Voices tantalized us to win plaster of Paris prizes by tossing a ring or knocking down bottles or popping balloons. There were the sword swallower, the fat woman, the maze of mirrors, the fortune teller, the upside-down rides. This, I thought, was life as it should be, pulsating with excitement and adventure, my own childhood taste of Babylon. As darkness arrived, the bright-colored lights mingled with the smells of pink cotton candy and caramel apples. Shadows danced everywhere. Swept along by the noisy crowd, we squeezed our way through the looming bodies of the throng that pressed in around us. From high overhead came the screams from the swirling neon Ferris wheels and rides. Our sleepy town no longer existed. This alone was real. All too soon, Mom and Dad would beckon us home. As they did, the sounds faded away into the distance, while older ones danced long into the night, and we were tucked into bed. Then one night while we slept, the calliope breathed its last. The lights were dimmed. Everything came down, folded away, and long before dawn, those huge trucks lurched over the curb and slipped out of town. The next morning on our way to school, there it was, that same vacant lot, ugly, dirty, flattened down, trash caught on crushed thistles, bottle caps, broken glass, sticky cotton candy clinging to the sawdust. Had it ever really happened? Could it have been only a dream? Often when I think of that time long ago, I imagine the world that Adam and Eve saw beyond the flaming sword. They were on their own. They were free from God. A world to make of their own choosing. On through the centuries, though always, quote, subjected to futility, the children of Adam have attempted to turn this vacant lot, the world, into their own Vanity Fair. Drowning out the screams and groans of human tragedy, the carnival has continued its show through the centuries. Newer sideshows, brighter lights, voracious video games, until at last we find ourselves on the edge of virtual reality, the ultimate fantasy. But darkness will come. There is a day when God will say, "The show is over, close it down." So that's a way to understand our world. So Adam and Eve had perfection. They said, we're going to choose to go our own way. They're expelled from the garden, but they moved out into this, the brave new world ahead of them. Let's make it what we can. And I'm not saying Adam and Eve's perspectives are wrong in what they did as they left the garden, but we know that shortly after them, their followers began to build their own world in their own image, make it their own way. I mean, the Tower of Babel, even before that, Lamech, who is it, that started building, or was it a different L name, who started building cities and things and raising himself up against the godly line of Seth was the ungodly line of Cain, but trying to remember who the man was that was so instrumental in the early civilization and the direction that civilization took, kind of opposed to God, that kind of culminated at Babel in many ways as one of the culminations. At any rate, mankind, as he said, has always been trying to create its own Vanity Fair, have all this excitement and entertainment and leisure and all these great things to do and taste and see and have. But it's temporary, and that's not the answer. It's a distraction from God. Vanity Fair and Pilgrim's Progress is not a good thing. At any rate, someday it all will close down. It's going to be over, and that's kind of the statement of chapter 24. Vanity Fair closes down. The end of these things comes to pass. The death groans of the earth. So, having kind of introduced that, let's read through chapter 14, because it's not, 24, not 14. 24. I'll just read it, just to kind of give it one go through. It isn't completely about woe all the way through. There's an interesting section tucked in the middle, but give it a listen. So, chapter 24 of Isaiah. Behold, the Lord will empty the earth and make it desolate, and he will twist its surface and scatter its inhabitants. And it shall be as with the people, so with the priest, as with the slave, so with his master, as with the maid, so with her mistress, as with the buyer, so with the seller, as with the lender, so with the borrower, as with the creditor, so with the debtor. The earth shall be utterly empty and utterly plundered, for the Lord has spoken his word. The earth mourns and withers, the world languishes and withers. The highest people of the earth languish. Their earth lies defiled under its inhabitants, for they have transgressed the laws, violated the statutes, broken the everlasting covenant. Therefore a curse devours the earth, and its inhabitants suffer for their guilt. Therefore the inhabitants of the earth are scorched, and few men are left. The wine mourns, the vine languishes, all the merry-hearted sigh. The mirth of the tambourines is stilled, the noise of the jubilant is ceased, the mirth of the lyre is stilled. No more do they drink wine with singing. Strong drink is bitter to those who drink it. The wasted city is broken down. Every house is shut up so that no one can enter. There is an outcry in the streets for lack of wine. All joy has grown dark. The gladness of the earth is banished. Desolation is left in the city. The gates are battered into ruins. For thus it shall be in the midst of the earth among the nations, as when an olive tree is beaten, as at the gleaning when the grape harvest is done. Now look, verse 14. They lift up their voices, they sing for joy. Over the majesty of the Lord they shout from the west. Therefore in the east to give glory to the Lord, in the coastlands of the sea give glory to the name of the Lord, the God of Israel. From the ends of the earth we hear songs of praise, of glory to the righteous one. And now in the middle of verse 16, but I say, I waste away, woe is me, for the traitors have betrayed. With betrayal the traitors have betrayed. Terror and the pit and the snare are upon you, O inhabitant of the earth. He who flees at the sound of the terror shall fall into the pit, and he who climbs out of the pit shall be caught in the snare. For the windows of heaven are opened, and the foundations of the earth tremble. The earth is utterly broken. The earth is split apart. The earth is violently shaken. The earth staggers like a drunken man. It sways like a hut. Its transgression lies heavy upon it, and it falls and will not rise again. On that day the Lord will punish the host of heaven. In heaven and the kings of the earth, on the earth, they will be gathered together as prisoners in a pit. They will be shut up in a prison, and after many days they will be punished. Then the moon will be confounded, and the sun ashamed, for the Lord of hosts reigns on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem, and his glory will be before his elders. That's an interesting chapter. So, he begins to bring out then in the notes a parallel between, and we'll have to look these things up and kind of take a look at them ourselves. I looked at them somewhat before I came today, but let's look at them together. So keep your hand in Isaiah 24 and turn over to the book of Revelation. Got your Bibles? Revelation chapter 18. In the section on the fall of Babylon, which we were looking at in the oracles of Isaiah. Lydia, you have your microphone ready there? All right, so he says, now flip back and forth. So keep them both open. In 24 of Isaiah, verses 7 through 12, just kind of glance over that again. The wine mourns, the vine languishes, the merry-hearted sigh, tambourines are stilled, jubilation has ceased, instruments have ceased, there's no drinking, no singing, cities broken, houses are closed, all gladness has been banished, desolation is left, the gates are battered into ruins. Now, Lydia, read Revelation 18, 21 through 23. He says there's some parallels that we ought to note here. Chapter 18 of Revelation, verses 21 to 23.
Then a mighty angel took up a stone like a great millstone and threw it into the sea, saying, So will Babylon, the great city, be thrown down with violence, and will be found no more. And the sound of harpists and musicians, of flute players and trumpeters, will be heard in you no more. And the craftsmen of any craft will be found in you no more. And the sound of the mill will be heard in you no more. The light of a lamp will shine in you no more, and the voice of bridegroom and bride will be heard in you no more. For your merchants were the great ones of the earth, and all nations were deceived by your sorcery.
Yeah, there's some parallels there I see. Particularly it talks about the music ceases. There's lamenting, there's sadness. Some similarities there. He says both describe, in other words, he's saying we're reading about kind of the end of the earth in our culture, which comes, I guess, at the end of the tribulation, essentially. I mean, it's in its death throes during the tribulation, but God comes and Jesus puts to death all who haven't trusted in him. It's kind of an ending to these things. And it's prophesied, as we saw when we studied Revelation last year, it's prophesied that Babylon is destroyed, and there's rejoicing over that. So these chapters, Isaiah 24 and Revelation 18, are describing the same time frame. Vanity Fair closes down, the judgment of Babylon, And these things are seen together here in these two books of the Bible. Babylon, remember, is not just a city geographically or a nation, it's a philosophical system. Okay, now, he says then that Isaiah, and keep your fingers in Revelation, we'll go back there again. Maybe I'll put a marker there myself, get a pen here and throw it in there so I don't lose track. Okay, Isaiah is an amazing writer. I mean, the things that we read there and his descriptive skills are pretty amazing. He says, Isaiah, as a master composer, uses contrast most expressively in this chapter. Yeah, there was a big contrast. It was so jarring, you almost wonder how it made it in the midst of that section. Joltingly, we read verses 14 through 16a. They are surrounded by the darkest of descriptions of the day of God's wrath. It is though somehow in the midst of the darkness and groanings, so here's this description that just a heavy word. Darkness and groaning. In the midst of that, it's like Isaiah hears somewhere in the distance, out there beyond the darkness, there's people singing somehow in the midst of all these things going on. Glory to the righteous one, they're saying. Now we know that's kind of like what we saw in Revelation, right? Where the saints and the angels are rejoicing. I mean, so the whole world is lamenting over the fall of Babylon. Commercial Babylon, religious Babylon, Babylon has fallen. All the people of the earth are mourning over this, and yet in the midst of that there's rejoicing in heaven among those who are God's. Same thing here. It's like Isaiah, as he's writing, it's like he hears this kind of way off in the distance, out where there's still light instead of just darkness. He hears the sound of the righteous rejoicing. The day of the Lord indeed is the doorway into the kingdom, he says. When at last God's wrath is spent, kingdom glory enters in all of its delights. All right. I'm going to pause there. That's the bulk of what I had tonight. I have one little section I might do yet, but maybe that's enough to start with. You didn't get to read much, I know. I read a whole lot. Lydia read. But what do you think so far, or what questions would you have, or what are your thoughts or senses, or how can we understand this in a way that applies to us? Microphone's here. Pass it around. Who would like to share something at this point? Hopefully somebody.
I guess what's most striking to me, just because being, I guess, kind of involved in popular culture, aware of it at least, was the lack of music, because obviously it's different than how they're describing it here, but you really can tell that people depend on music a lot, and that started, what were we looking at, like 1930s or something? Back.
Yep. Popular music became a thing even earlier than that, I'd say, with the rise of radio, phonographs.
Yeah. We were sort of thinking about how in a time, after World War I, I think, when people could have been reflecting and having their minds drawn to God, instead movies became really popular. And
just distraction.
Yeah, 80 million a week went to go see movies. I don't know. A lot of people. And it's sort of similar today. I mean, music is a very distracting thing, and people really, I don't know if you can maybe say worship. Because there are artists that people are like almost obsessed with, or even not just on that level, just they like the music and they listen to it all the time. Really anything that distracts you from thinking about other stuff is...
Stuff of more importance.
Yeah, I guess it's an idol, so the lack of music in the morning seems like a very stark contrast from what I see in the world.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting that it shows up in both those sections about there's no more music. I mean, God created music as a source of joy, and ultimately it's one of many ways in which he can be glorified, and he can become an object of attention. People would pay attention to God. Music was meant to draw people to him in many ways. It's not like he created it as the only purpose of music is to point to him necessarily, but you can see his stamp upon the reality of how music works, this interaction of tones and things and how it and sounds and how it affects mood and lifts our spirits. I mean, it's truly a supernatural thing, music is, the fact of music. And even people who have no acknowledgement of God at all and don't care about God at all, music is a powerful thing for them. And to think about a world with no music, or a time when things are so bleak that people stop all music, that's an interesting thing to think about. When people, well, even in some of the books we were reading recently, the one guy, Sir Dinadan, he didn't want to play his music anymore because he was so sad over what had happened. And yet they encouraged him that now's the time when we need that sort of thing. Anyway, yeah, music is an interesting thing to think about in this context, and in the judgment of the day of God's wrath, the judgment day, the music is absent. Yeah, interesting thought. Nathan?
Suppose this is just another area of like knowing without fully knowing in practice, but just mulling over that. I guess the illustration he used and what you said about it distracting from more important things, just I know in my mind and like after eating some candy or ice cream or watching a movie, playing a game, all sorts of things like that, seeing music for a while, I know in my head that the things they bring us are very fleeting, and the satisfaction of it doesn't last very long at all, regardless of what kind of thing it is. And of course, when I actually think about, looking back over one's life, and standing before God, and that sort of thing, that I think, well, obviously I wouldn't wish I'd spent more time doing that, and yet there's still times I do it too much, because I think it is that same reason of, maybe not all the time, but of not wanting to think about the hard and difficult things in life, or the hard choices, or people who are hurting, or things like that. It's probably one of the reasons that it's appealing, because it does kind of make it hard to think about those things when you're thinking about experiencing that stuff instead. And yet, even if that was a good thing, it still doesn't work even in that way, because you can't do that all the time. It'll still come back, but you'll be less able to deal with it because you're avoiding it. And I think that's the thing. So it's not just like wanting to do it because of boredom, because too much boredom maybe could lead to actually thinking about those important things and what God wants and what life's actually about. And like you're saying, people don't want to think about those things because they're hard and difficult and not what the flesh wants. So yeah, like you said, it's been around one way or another ever since sin entered the human race.
Thinking about those few verses stuck in the middle that just don't seem to fit. I think it's an interesting contrast, because they're talking about, the earth is mourning, and everybody is, oh, this is terrible, all this awfulness is happening, because the things that they have put their trust in are being destroyed. Whether it's their their land or their home or their job or their family or whatever. Things are being destroyed and taken away from them, and so everyone is mourning and afraid and, oh, woe is us, what is happening, and everything. And even just the idea that their music is no more because they have nothing to be happy about anymore. Everything is ruined. And then they have these verses about singing for joy and giving God the glory with songs of praise and everything. And it's interesting to me, it's because that is the one thing that can never be taken from us. We have God, we have that relationship with him, and it doesn't matter what happens or to this earth or to us or anything, is that we will never lose that. That can never be taken. And so if no one has, or if someone doesn't have that hope in God, then of course they're going to be in mourning and feeling ruined and destroyed, and there's nothing to be happy about because the things of earth can so easily be taken away and destroyed. And this is just going to be it happening in on such levels that people had never even seen before of destruction and all that. So it's just that encouragement that it doesn't matter how bad things are, we can still praise God, because the things of this earth are temporary. They're going to be destroyed sometime, either now or later. But we have our hope in God, and that can never be destroyed or taken away. So we can sing no matter what, no matter how bad things are. But the world will not be able to.
Yeah. Yeah, go
I
ahead,
think the
Frank.
one thing to go along with that maybe is that in verse 23, and the Lord reigns of hosts reigns on Mount Zion and Jerusalem, and his glory will be with the elders forever. It kind of points to there is a happy ending to the story.
Yeah, amen. It brings that perspective back in, like there's this heavy stuff, but hey, the Lord is reigning, and he's, yeah, it's a good way to end that up, isn't it? It kind of goes along a little bit more with the words of encouragement in the midst, as Andrew was talking about. Yeah. Other thoughts or comments? On Vanity Fair closing down, the judgment against the earth. There's a little bit of a thing too, since we were in Revelation and Isaiah 24 before. If you're still in Revelation, I could try to look at this last one a little bit. In 24, Caleb, can you grab the microphone there and read verses 21 and 22? Where is it now? Since haven't heard you on the mic yet, then I need to have Iva read next then, I guess, so we can get everybody on the microphone. All right, so he says here that there is an apparent relationship between two different sections. Iva, I'm going to have trouble telling you which verses to read here, but let's start with Caleb's. So in chapter 24, read 21 and 22, Caleb. Isaiah 24, verse 21 and 22.
On that day the Lord will punish the host of heaven in heaven, and the kings of the earth on the earth. They will be gathered together as prisoners in a pit. They will be shut up in a prison, and after many days they will be punished.
Okay, so with that in mind, turn over to Revelation chapter 20. Where would I have you read, though? Yeah. Iva, would you read for us in Revelation 21, 2, and 3?
And I saw an angel coming down out of heaven, having the key to the abyss, and holding in his hand a great chain. He seized the dragon, that ancient serpent, who is the devil or Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. He threw him into the abyss and locked and sealed it over him, to keep him from deceiving the nations any more, until the 1,000 years were ended. After that, he must be set free for a short time.
And then maybe jump over to verse more like 12. Why don't you start at 12, Iva, and keep reading?
And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and books were opened. Another book was opened, which is the book of life. The dead were judged according to what they had done, as recorded in the books. The sea gave up the dead that were in it, and death and Hades gave up the dead that were in them, and each person was judged according to what he had done. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. The lake of fire is the second death. If anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire.
Okay. So regarding the millennium and this time to come after the great white throne judgment, there's a relationship between what we read in Isaiah 24, where it talks, as Caleb read, about they will be gathered together, those who are being judged, gathered together as prisoners in a pit, shut up in a prison. After many days they will be punished. And we have, I think, a greater statement on this same sort of thing then, or probably the same event in Revelation more clearly about the great white throne judgment. And he's talking about this in the notes. The verses in Isaiah describe what will happen to the wicked rulers of the earth at the time when God comes to judge the world, the day of the Lord. As they will be gathered, confined in a dungeon, and after many days they will be punished. He says, by this time all the saints will have been resurrected to share Christ's kingdom reign. But, quote, the rest of the dead, Revelation 25, remain that way until the end of the 1,000 years. They remain dead. Then they are resurrected, verses 12 to 13, and finally judged by God. This delay in their judgment appears to parallel Isaiah 24, verses 21 and 22. He says this would support the belief in premillennialism, that Christ will return before a yet future earthly kingdom age, during which time God will fulfill those special earthly Davidic kingdom promises to the nation Israel, after which the wicked dead are raised to face the great white throne judgment described in Revelation 20. Yeah, so there's an interesting pairing of those sections, again from Revelation to Isaiah 24. And he has one more, if we want to look at one more. It's kind of longer though. Well, we can just reference it. So in 24, Isaiah 24, he says, note the more than coincidental parallels between 6 through 12. Let's see. That's just before the joy part. It's about the wine, about the music again, about not enjoying wine or drinking, and houses are shut up and all the joy is gone. And he says, or is this already too much what we already saw? Revelation 18, 21 through 23, isn't that what we already read? Yeah, we already read that. He just was ending with that in his notes. He says, jot down some of the more parallel expressions which focus on possessions and pleasure. I guess he was just trying to make a point there about possessions and pleasure, and that these things are, I guess, ceasing at this point. So that's what he has as he wraps up, finishes off with chapter 24, and then we start a new section that is longer, not a lot longer, next time. A little different than judgment on the whole earth. The next one is called Hope, God is Faithful. So that'll be kind of relief from what we read this time. Any more thoughts, questions, comments, applications tonight?
Just also thinking sort of back to what we were saying before, that when it's can be hard for even those who've been saved sometimes to remember just how wonderful God is and all his great and precious promises and all we had to be thankful for, or just fail to comprehend how great and wonderful he really is, and what there is to come that won't be destroyed or lost. It's well, it's easy to see why those who are unable to understand those things, who haven't had it revealed so that they can understand it, who are still controlled by the world system and sin and all that, they would think this idea of people singing in the midst of destruction, they'd think they're madmen and madwomen for rejoicing in the midst of that, because there's no way they could understand that, because until you're saved, you're still having a hatred of God and thinking of him as a tyrant or someone who doesn't exist, or a killjoy, or all those lying, wrong things that people say about God. And can't imagine why someone would be so happy about God and not upset about these other things, and because they don't understand that God is better than all this stuff that will be destroyed, and it doesn't make any sense to them, but it's the truth.
Yeah. The darkened mind cannot understand these things. Any other thoughts tonight? Oh, Domino's Pizza's here. I guess we're done. Maybe they're just turning around. Did somebody call in a pizza? Ready to be done? Thank you for your participation tonight. We'll do it again.